Ladies and gentlemen, we have a rare privilege today. This is Dick Rossi. He was an ace with the Flying Tigers in China. And today he's going to tell us about Claire Chennault, the Curtiss P-40, the Flying Tigers, and a variety of his experiences. Dick, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, you're very welcome.
It's an honor for me to meet you and interview you.
Thank you.
Let's start off with Claire Lee Chennault. He was a high school teacher and principal when World War I was going on, and he went into the Army Air Corps in World War I.
Right.
And he was a pilot in World War I, and so, which would have been 1917. Then he stayed in the Army afterwards and became famous for precision flight, or something like the Blue Angels today.
Well, that's correct. He had the flying trapeze act that he did to perform 3 biplanes doing rolls and doing all kinds of maneuvers in formation, and that was the origin of it. And his main thing was pursuit tactics. In those days, the Army called it pursuit, not fighter. Only the Navy called them fighters. But he was the advocate of pursuit fighters, and he still claimed that the pursuit planes, properly used, could divert bombers. And that wasn't very well believed in those days.
Flying, which you have just seen done by the demonstration team from the Air Corps Tactical School, illustrates what may be done in the way of training pilots. Such training, however, must be consistent. Pilots must be trained almost daily and must be continued over long periods of time.
Now, even though his theory was correct, and just about everything that he suggested, he didn't get very far because of his personality. He was abrasive and rude to his superiors, and so he didn't advance to general, did he?
Well, that's true. I don't know that he was really abrasive. He was just determined. If he believed something, he expounded it all the time. And if someone above disagreed with him, he'd try to convince him, and he was hard to convince by some of those people. And the Billy Mitchell story, the bomber, say that they had the predominance of their deal and they'd be too fast for fighters, didn't take into account that the fighters could be used, and they were as fast as bombers.
Jimmy Doolittle had the same problem as Claire Chennault. He got out of the Army in 1930, and he was still a lieutenant because their generals would come in and say, "What does this button do?" And he would say, "Get your hand off of there. Get away from that airplane. Get out of this hangar." And they would say, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And he would say, "Yeah, an idiot. Get away from that airplane." So they shared the same type of personality. Anyway, he got out of the Army in 1936 or so, still a captain.
Right, so he retired as a captain.
And he was hired to go to China to evaluate their situation and build an air force.
Well, that's correct. He was supposed to go over and report directly to Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang on the condition of the Air Force. The problem that they had...
Which was lousy.
Well, yeah. The problem is that the commanders didn't report the true condition of their planes. Where they had maybe 500 planes in their inventory, maybe even 100 of them would be lucky to be flyable. But this part wasn't reported to them. So it looked like they had like a much better airport than they did. Chennault pointed all that out, and he gave them the true picture of their actual condition.
Which is not always pleasant.
Right.
Well, after they discovered that they really were in bad shape, they had sort of a swap meet air force that they had gotten a bunch of old airplanes and from different countries and different kinds. What did he do?
Well, they had these different airplanes. They had Russian, Italian, German, American. They had all kinds of different airplanes, and they were all in the obsolete class. So Chennault went about, then he was required to retrain the Chinese Air Force to get their academy going, their training schools organized. And while this was taking place, they figured it wasn't moving fast enough, that they couldn't get these people trained in time to do much because the Japanese were very active. They
In
were,
1937, the rape of Nanking occurred, where in 3 days the Japanese butchered 40,000 Chinese civilians.
well, I just came back from Nanking. They claimed the number was more like 300,000 were actually slaughtered.
I wouldn't be surprised.
And they have some pretty good records on it. I was over there, just a matter of fact, in October, and they have a monument up there to the foreigners who helped China. But the number was much higher, and they were bombing all these areas. They were bombing Shanghai, Nanjing, and then when Generalissimo moved the capital to Chongqing, they started bombing Chongqing on a regular basis.
But they punished Nanking especially because they resisted. All the other cities had just sort of rolled over and surrendered, and Nanking fought back, so they punished them.
Well, they punished them very badly. Now, we had pilots who were flying, Chinese pilots who were flying, trying to defend Nanking, but they were running out of equipment. Their planes were getting shot down. The Japanese were flying slightly advanced airplanes against them. And
Did they have the Zeros at that time?
the Zeros, I believe, came out just a little bit later, but they came to the fleet somewhere in that area right after that deal. I think it was more like the 38s or 39s maybe that they...
Well, I remember that
first came
Claire
along.
Chenault made a study of the Zero, and he said it's 500 pounds lighter than anything the Americans have, and it can turn a circle inside anything the Americans have. And he sent it to Washington, and they didn't believe him.
Well, it was a very maneuverable airplane, very advanced for its day. The biggest drawback that the Japanese had during the, say, 1940 to 45 period was that they never improved it. And
Like the Model A Ford.
Yeah, right. It was so good, they just kept thinking that they didn't need to make it any better, and our planes kept getting better and better.
So he took his hat in his hand, and he went to Washington, D.C., and met with, I guess, Roosevelt, Marshall, and Hap Arnold. And he had a covert operation in mind. Would you tell our viewers what that was?
Well, what he did when he came over there, now the plan was to get American pilots and bring American pilots to China, because they were already trained. He wanted to get originally P-40 pilots out of the Air Corps.
But America was not at war with Japan, so they had to be very careful.
Well, that's very true, but the idea they come up with is that the people would resign their commission for 1 year, go to China, fight for 1 year, and then they would come back and go right back into their service. And that was the original plan. I think his best...
that really isn't what happened, though, is it?
Well, his best backing didn't come from Marshall or any of the military people. His main backing came from people like Secretary Knox, Secretary Morgenthau, and other advisors to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt liked the idea, and over the objections of the military, he okayed it.
Let's mention that Marshall did not like Claire Chenault, and Hap Arnold did not like Claire Chenault. But Roosevelt liked the plan, and so he made them accept it. He put it through.
Well, that's right. He was impressed by Chenault and by what he said he would do. And when he okayed this, he had a lot of backing from the cabinet, from his cabinet, close cabinet and advisors. And the military wasn't, they tried to raise objections, but one thing to remember is that starting in 1939, the end of the year, September, is when we had our draft started, the lottery draft. And every military service was trying to expand heavily. So nobody wanted to give up anything, which military people don't anyway.
Right.
And General Marshall said that if you take 100 of my pilots, we won't have any Air Force. So it was said that Roosevelt said, well, if 100 pilots are taken away and you don't have an Air Force, you haven't even got an Air Force
We don't
now.
have much of an Air Force, right?
So as it turned out, of course, he wasn't very successful in getting P-40 pilots, or that they were using then. And also they enlarged it to take in pilots from the Navy also, Navy and Marine Corps.
Now, as it turned out, he went back to China with the Joint Board Plan, which included civilian pilots, mercenaries, too.
Well, the plan, of course, as we resigned our commissions, we all became civilians. And that was the necessity because we were not at war with Japan.
Oh, I see. So when they say that the Flying Tigers were American civilians, you were civilians because you had resigned your commission.
That's correct. We
I
all
see.
had military training.
I
Every
see.
pilot that he recruited came out of the military.
So that was in 1941.
In 41, they were doing the recruiting. But they had, surprising as it seems, they had an awful time getting 100 pilots.
Is that right?
They ended up going into the Navy, the Marine Corps. As it turned out, about 55% of the pilots came out of the Navy. And
Is that
none of
right?
the Navy pilots had ever even seen a P-40 before. And they didn't have more than 10 pilots from the Army Air Corps who had ever flown P-40s before.
Well, let's talk about the P-40. China wasn't supposed to get those P-40s, the Flying Tiger airplanes. They were supposed to go someplace else.
Well, the story on the original 100 P-40s that we received, they were assigned originally to Sweden. And then Sweden was invaded by Germany and they went neutral, so they were reassigned to the British. But at that time, the British didn't have sufficient pilots to fly them because they were running short. So they opted to let these go to the Chinese in return for getting 100 later models and improved models of the P-40.
So the Chinese had an instant air force of 100 Curtiss P-40s.
Right, at approximately January of 41, these planes were sold to the Chinese.
And you had, was it 86 pilots, 100 airplanes and 86 pilots?
Well, we started out with 100 airplanes. One was dropped in the drink when they were unloading it.
That's
so it
99.
It was never used. We recruited a little over 100 pilots, maybe 105 or whatever it was. But by the time, some of them, as soon as they got out there and saw the conditions, just turned around and went home. A few of them used it as a ruse to get out of the service, because at that time, you couldn't get out of the service during that buildup that was going on in 41. So
the ones who stayed and the ones that you had as a mass group.
yeah, we ended up with around the high 80s, and then of course several were killed in accidents, training accidents in Tunggu. But out of the 99 airplanes, 33 were assigned to each of the 3 squadrons. We were divided into 3 squadrons.
So he had the airplanes and he had the first contingent of the Flying Tigers, the AVG, the American Volunteer Group. And he took the first contingent and the Curtiss P-40s, and he went to a British base in Burma, a British Air Force base in Burma to do the training.
Well, that's true. When they arrived in China, they were behind, because all of this was happening rather rapidly. They were preparing quarters for us in China, which weren't ready. And so the planes were arriving. The original group was a bunch of mechanics and ground people who went out to assemble the planes. Then the pilots started arriving in July, and they worked to deal with the British, where they could use this new base that was built at Tunggu, which is about 180 miles north of Rangoon. Now, this base had a blacktop runway, and the monsoon was on, and it was the only place suitable that they could fly these airplanes in that weather. Where they had a runway to land on instead of a muddy field. And with a little pressure from our government and the lend-lease we were given British, we were allowed to use this on the provision that no activity against Japanese could originate there.
Training only.
Yeah, training only.
Then Thanksgiving, 1941, you painted something on the front of the airplane.
Well, this came in November. In November, on November 2nd in Bombay, they had the India News daily. They printed in the rotogravure section. On the front was a big colored picture of a British tomahawk in the African desert with the shark's mouth on it. And that took 2 weeks to arrive in Tunggu because of the
So
way.
it didn't originate with you in China?
Oh no, the P-40 deal on the P-40 originated with a British squadron that was in North Africa. This newspaper or rotogravure section arrived in in Rangoon was on sale at Tanggu on Sunday, 2 weeks after it came out. And on Monday morning, we all had copies of it down in our tents, and everybody thought this was a great idea, and immediately some of the people started getting paint and painting it on, and Chenault okayed it. Everybody liked so much. Within a week, every plane we had had the Tiger's
and it became your trademark.
Shark Tiger on it.
Now, November 26th, the second contingent of the AVG, American Volunteer Group, sailed for China, and while they were sailing to China, Japan launched its fleet to attack Pearl Harbor.
Well, when we were authorized, when Roosevelt authorized this original deal, he really authorized 3 groups. We were the first group. We went out there as the FAVG, First American Volunteer Group. The second group was going to be a bombing group, and the third group was going to be another fighter group. Now, the bombing group was being recruited and was on, some of the planes were on ships on their way out there. And when Pearl Harbor was hit, they diverted them to Australia, and those people who had resigned from the service were all signed back in again to the service, so they ended up in the Air Force down in Australia.
Well, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and war came between the United States and Japan, then the joint board plan wasn't necessary anymore because you didn't have to worry about covert, because you're at war with Japan. Now you can do overt acts of war.
Well, that's true. Our original mission, our first fighter group, was to protect the Burma Road from the Burma border to Kunming, because at that time we didn't think they were going to attack Burma, which was a British colony. So our whole mission was to protect that part that went from the border into the city of Kunming.
And they had, Japan had 1,500 airplanes stationed on mainland China against your 86, 87 airplanes.
Well, they also had many airplanes that they had, they were also attacking all Southeast Asia. So they had airplanes in Indonesia and other places they had already taken over. And when we got the word of Pearl Harbor, of course, the whole mission was changed altogether. We were now allies. We were back into the fight against Japan officially, and there was nothing covert about it anymore. The only problem is we were all civilians.
Tell us what happened December 20th, 30 miles south of Kunming.
Well, we were preparing to move up to Kunming around the early part of December, around the 1st December. We'd already sent some of our trucks and some of our equipment up the road, carrying, matter of fact, most of our ammunition was en route to Kunming on trucks when Pearl Harbor happened. So we got together as soon as we could. The British wanted us all to go down to Rangoon to help the RAF protect Rangoon. The Chinese wanted us all to go to Kunming. So they compromised and sent the 3rd Squadron down to Rangoon on the 12th of December. And we were finally ready on the 18th of December to fly into China, into Kunming. So those who didn't have airplanes, which I was one of them, we flew up to China with Chenault on a CNAC DC-3. And we landed there on the 18th, and then the 1st and 2nd Squadron also flew in that afternoon. That was the largest group of airplanes we ever had in the air at one time.
Well, the Japanese sent 72 bombers and 40 fighters to Kunming.
Well,
and you met them, the Flying Tigers met them, and it was the first time that the Japanese had been stopped.
Well, there's a little mix up on that. The biggest fight we had was actually down in Rangoon. When we arrived there December 18th, the Japanese had bombed that day. They weren't sending any fighters over Kunming because there was no opposition. They would just go and bomb. They used it almost as training. Training method.
Yearly, every year they would use it as a training method.
Well, they were coming up there. So we arrived there the 18th to see all these scenes of this bombing and these dead people all around the place. And on the 19th, we were ready waiting for them, and I was on duty that day. Nothing happened. On the 20th, we were waiting for them again. It was my day off, but the 1st and 2nd squadrons took off because we got reports they were coming in. And actually, they were just sending 10 bombers on the training mission. And they come over, and there was quite a bit of clouds around. It was a little hard to see anything, but the 1st and 2nd squadron made contact with them and shot down some of them and forced them, and they never got through the city. And that was the first time that Kunming had gone without being hit when the Japanese started over. And for the rest of the time that we were in Kunming, they never came baake. So
and the
Chinese
people gave you a parade and treated you as heroes because you saved them from the annual slaughter.
That's right. They would come out there, the school children, the people of the town, and everybody. It was quite heartwarming.
When you took off against the Japanese, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, you were outnumbered 20 to 1.
Well, there was they had sent big amounts over. On the 23rd of December over Rangoon, they sent fleet after fleet of bombers
that
and
was
fighters.
the day. I'm sorry, I got my dates mixed up. The Christmas Day.
Well, the 2 days before Christmas.
2 days before Christmas, they started the Battle of Burma.
Yes.
And they sent 72 bombers and 40 fighters, and you shot down 63 airplanes.
That was the first day that they sent such a big one, and the first day that they hit Rangoon. That day we had 2 pilots were killed in aerial combat. We had some good scores against them, and working with the RAF. Down there we worked side by side with the RAF. And then because they didn't expect to get hit that badly and lose so many planes, they broadcasted on Christmas Day they'd give us a Christmas present. And sure enough, on Christmas Day they come over with a bigger group, and they lost more. And that day we didn't lose any planes, any pilots. We lost a couple airplanes, but we didn't lose any pilots.
The number that I read in the history book was 63 Japanese planes lost, 2 American planes lost.
Yeah, well, we had a couple get shot down. Someone had to bail out, but...
I want to mention, while we're on this subject, Dick Rossi was an ace in the Flying Tigers. He shot down 6 enemy airplanes. We owe him honor and respect. And one of the purposes of Aviation Theater is to promote our heroes and to tell the stories that many people don't know. So I salute you, and let's go on with your story.
Well, thank you.
Later, Rangoon fell. Burma fell.
Yeah, well, they kept shuffling us in and out of Rangoon. The 3rd Squadron was the ones that were down there for those 2 big fights on the 23rd and 25th. Between Christmas and New Year's, they were pulled back for a rest, and the 2nd Squadron was sent in. And then on the early week of January, the leader of the 2nd Squadron told Chenault he would like more planes, he'd like more backup. So Chenault said that he would send down 8 of the planes from our squadron, from the 1st Squadron. So a bunch of us volunteered trying to get in on it, and I was happened to be one of the lucky ones who got to go in that first 8. So we went down to reinforce the 2nd Squadron. So then our group that arrived there at that time, we stayed there until the Rangoon fell at the end of February. And the 2nd Squadron left about the end of January to go back up.
Officially, Rangoon fell March 7th. And then in April, Chenault was promoted to Brigadier General.
Well, then he was signed up into the Air Force, yes. But we had, we left Rangoon. When Rangoon fell, our last day there was the last day of February. The ground people were walking in, and...
Well, now, Stilwell was in full retreat, because after Rangoon fell...
Well, not yet.
Oh.
They had barely got him down there. See, he came up into central Burma and Mamio, where he had his headquarters. And when we lost Rangoon, we moved up to a place called Magway, which was maybe 30 miles or so south of where Stilwell was. And then we were there all of March, and when we left there, and had to retreat from there and go up into China. We exited through Mamio. As a matter of fact, the first night out, several of us spent the night at Stilwell's headquarters with him. And,
Vinegar Joe.
Oh yeah, we were telling him how to win the war, but he wasn't too interested.
I liked his haircut. Then April 29th, the Japanese took Lashio. And they were on their way to the Salween Gorge. And would you tell our viewers about that? Because it's something big in history that they need to know about. The Salween Gorge.
Well, after we retreated from Loy Wing, we had to leave Loy Wing because the same thing, the Japanese had moved in. The ground troops were advancing all the time. Regardless of how bad we would maul the Air Force, the ground troops kept getting closer and closer. So they started up the Burma Road on their way to Kunming, and they got across to the Salween River, and they had destroyed the bridge there, but they...
The Japanese were at the bridge, and the Chinese blew their own bridge.
Yeah, and when we bombed some of it, and they had Chinese still on the other side. Some of them got caught on the other side, wrong side. But when in the meantime, we had received some P-40Es from the Air Force, and they had bomb racks on them. So some of our people, we had Navy people there who had been dive bombers in the fleet off the carriers, and Tex Hill led this flight, one of the flights of P-40Es over there with the bombs on them, and they were bombing the bridge, and they hit the side of the wall, caused kind of a landslide, pinned in a bunch of Japanese tanks and troops, and from there on they ran numerous missions over there, strafing and bombing what was the remnants of it, and that was the end of the Japanese advance into China. From there, they turned around after that and started retreating back into Burma.
And that was the Japanese Red Dragon, their 15th Army, their crack army.
Yeah, we call that was when the Tigers turned the tide. They turned the advance backwards.
Now, I need to mention that before this happened, Claire Chennault analyzed the situation, and he realized that there would be Chinese killed if this action took place. And so he radioed Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and he said, what is your decision? And his answer was, destroy the enemy.
Well, that's right. He had to make the decision to go ahead and stop them. And that's what they did. And like I say, it turned out real well. That was when they turned it backwards. The advance then went the other way. And
well, with 8 planes, the Flying Tigers killed 4,500 enemy troops and destroyed their column and put them into a full rout.
Well, that's right. They were on their way back. What was left of them went back into Burma.
They were hightailing it back.
Yeah, they never come back up.
And they never came back. Yeah. They had enough whenever they got a taste of the Flying Tigers.
Well, the terrain there was pretty hostile to them. They had these narrow gorges and high mountains, and that Burma Road was no freeway.
Now, General Stilwell was replaced by General Bissell, and there were some hard feelings about that.
Well, General Bissell was kind of an antagonist of General Chennault from way back in early days. And then General Bissell came in to try to recruit us back into the service. And he did it in such an abrasive and threatening mood that everybody told him to go jump on the lake.
Could it be that you didn't stand up when he entered the room, and you didn't salute, and you didn't say, sir?
Well,
and with him being a West Pointer, a member of the club, that he didn't like that.
But he was a colonel at the time, and sure enough, to spite Chennault, Arnold made him a brigadier general one day ahead of Chennault.
So he would have rank.
So he would have rank over Chennault.
Date of rank.
But in his recruitment deal there, it got to the point where the little kids in China used to follow us around, you know, and they'd imitate everything we did, you know. We'd go like this, ding hao, and every little kid in town on the way would say...
That means can do.
Yeah, ding hao, very good, ding hao. And we taught all these little kids to say piss on Bissell. And every time he'd go by, they'd all yell from the side of the road.
And they didn't know what they were saying.
No, they had no idea what they were saying. They just figured
That went over big with
everybody.
him, I'm sure.
We all laughed, and they thought it was great. But he pretty much screwed up the whole recruitment deal. They had a deal which we weren't aware of at the time, but they couldn't put us into the service or force us into service on foreign soil. And that's why the.
But if you left.
But we could. Go back. Well, he told us if we left, we'd all be drafted as privates.
As soon as you set foot on American soil.
And then they said they wouldn't give us any of us rides back to the States or any transportation back.
That's good public relations, isn't it?
Yeah, well, he was great on that. But that was one of the reasons why this second American volunteer group, that was the bomber group, they were able to put them back in the service because they were on board an American ship. That's considered
at
American.
the time, yeah.
Overseas, that's considered American territory.
An American airplane or an American ship.
If you're on an American ship, that's considered American territory. So they were able to put them all back in.
Okay.
But we weren't even.
Let me mention one thing. One of the reasons that Marshall and Arnold and Bissell and some of the others didn't like Claire Chennault was because he was not a West Pointer. He wasn't a member of the club. But General Marshall was not a West Pointer. When General Marshall was 18 years old, he applied for an application to go to West Point.
Yeah.
And his congressman, of course you go by congressional appointment,
Yeah.
and his congressman says, I'm sorry, Sonny, but your family is from the wrong political party. And he wouldn't give him an appointment to West Point. So Marshall went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and he became chief of staff, and he was not a West Pointer, but he criticized Chennault for not being a West Pointer.
Well, there was a little bit of envy there, too. Chennault was, our victories came at a time when everything was pretty bad. And because they were having so much bad news, we were getting a lot of publicity. And I think that was a little bit of, a lot of envy grew in there.
Absolutely.
And the only other thing that was really good at the time was the Doolittle Mission, and unfortunately they had to leave too early.
But that was led by the same kind of guy. Jimmy Doolittle was the same kind of guy as Claire Chennault.
Well, he and his group, the ones that survived there, all came through Kunming and Chungking and Kunming. As a matter of fact, he brought down the stars to pin on Chennault, the stars when he got his brigadier general.
Well, then he did make major general later on. Chennault.
Yes.
Chennault made major general.
Well, they gave him a lieutenant general about the time he died.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, about 58. He died in 58.
Yeah,
in 43,
they upped him.
They made him commander of the 14th Air Force and promoted him to major general.
Right.
Let me mention just something about Jimmy Doolittle. When President Roosevelt gave him the Medal of Honor, he also jumped him from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. And as he pinned the stars on him, he said, Jimmy, you would have been a general a long time ago if you could just learn to keep your big mouth shut. So I think Claire Chennault and Jimmy Doolittle were alike in that way.
Well, Jimmy did all right. He ended up with 4 stars before he passed away.
Yes.
And he was a true gentleman. Plus, he was a scholar. He was a scientist. He was responsible for many innovations in aviation.
Yep.
From aviation fuel to instrument flying. Doolittle had his finger in it.
Yes, he was.
And he said when he got China, it was so good to see some American faces there on that mission in April when he came through.
So by July 4th, 1942, the AVG was to cease operations. And you knew, and the Japanese knew, that by July 4th, the Flying Tigers were to be no more.
Right.
And so they were holding back and waiting until July 4th. So between Salween and July 4th, you fought one more battle at Hanyang?
Well, we had a little action. Now, we had one at Guilin also. We were a little active down on the Eastern Front for a while there. When we left, we went down there around the end of May, and we were there June and up to the 4th of July in Guilin, and we were spread between Hanyang and Lingling for different missions, and 2 squadrons were down there, the 1st and the 2nd. And they kept us a little busy, but the problem was that the Air Force hadn't gotten around to sending in replacements for our group. So here comes the 4th of July, and there were only half a dozen people there.
Surprise! Your replacement is that you change hats,
right,
and you become your own replacement.
So a very unusual situation took place. They asked for volunteers to stay an extra 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, they were now the 23rd Fighter Group, and they were commanded by Bob Neal, who was our first squadron leader and our leading ace, who was a civilian. So I guess it's probably...
Did he get 12?
No, he had 15.
15?
Yeah, he was here. Tex Hill was second with 12. But he was probably one of the only civilians that ever commanded an air group in the U.S. Air Force for 2 weeks. And then he left and came back to the States and flew in a covert operation on the Atlantic.
And then you were absorbed into the United States Air Force.
Well, only 5 pilots joined, and of the 5 who joined, Ed Rector and Tex Hill had come out of the Navy, but they went into the Air Force instead. Several of them who had been Navy or Marines went into the Air Force, changed over.
So out of the 86 pilots, as of July 4th, how many did you have left? And what became of them?
Right off, I really don't know how many we had left. I'm sure we were about down into the low 70s somewhere.
Well, you only had 12 killed and 4 taken prisoner.
Yeah.
So that would be into the 70s. And out of the 70 pilots, did most of them become Army Air Force pilots?
No, they varied quite a bit. About 18 of us actually went to work flying the hump for China National.
China, India, Burma.
CNAC.
Flying the hump.
When we started flying the hump because the Army didn't have anybody there yet.
So you went from Curtiss P-40s
from
to
P-40s to C-47s.
C-47,
and then
military
C-46s.
DC-3.
Yeah, and C-46s. And a bunch of them went to work on this Atlantic covert operation, which was run by the Navy secretly, but it was supposed to be run by American export shipping lines. And the reason to have this airline run was because as an airline it could fly into neutral Switzerland. And that was how they used to get their spies in and out of Europe.
So there's nothing new.
Yeah.
Oliver North wasn't doing anything new, was he?
Not very much.
That's been going on for a long time. Yeah. The president says, I need somebody for a dirty job that has to be done. And Oliver North says, I'll do it. Yeah. And then they say, I need somebody to take the blame for this. And you say, I'll do it. Yeah. But it's nothing new. This has been going on for years.
Well, that's true. It depends on how it turns out, what happens.
If it turns out, everything's nice. If it turns out, I need a show of hands for people who are willing to be the scapegoat.
Yeah.
Who'll take the heat for the president.
But, you know, each of the people who were involved in this did it with one idea. They were doing it for the good of the country. So,
I interviewed Grant Brown just briefly at one of the Miramar air shows. I don't know if you happen to remember him or not. Grant Brown. He flew with the Flying Tigers. And I said, now, you got... the money was an interesting thing, was what I was bringing up. First of all, China didn't have any money to pay you. So they sent Madam Chang to the United States, and she gave speeches and appealed for donations, and Americans gave donations to Madam Chang, and she took the money back to China and gave it to Chiang Kai-shek, and he paid you with it for each airplane you shot down.
Well, they had a lead-lease deal going out there, similar to British. You know.
But I said, you got $500 for each airplane you shot down. And Grant Brown says, no, we got $600. So did you get paid for each airplane you shot down?
Well, when we went out there, nothing was ever mentioned about that when we were recruited to us, and it wasn't in our contract. But it was a rumor. As it turned out, at the end of the deal, they did pay us $500, but you mentioned the Grant Brown. We didn't have the only Brown we had in our group was Carl Brown. And this guy must not have been an AVG.
Oh, well.
I'll tell you, there are thousands who claim they were an AVG.
Is that right?
Even though our total ground and all was never over 300.
Well, they say that there were 40,000 people at Woodstock and 10 million people who say they were at Woodstock.
Yeah, well, that's true with the AVG. See, we were, for the first time, for the original part, and even a lot of our bulletins and everything that come out as late as July still had FAVG on them. But as soon as that group, Pearl Harbor came, and that group was impounded down in Australia, we dropped the F officially.
Yeah.
And didn't say like a Rangoon paper at the end of a day when they're writing up what happened during the day. They always had us as AVG and RAF. Whenever they'd write up, they'd say the RAF and AVG, you know, did this, did that, whatever. But
well, we've talked today about Claire Lee Chenault. We've talked about the Curtiss P-40. We've talked about the AVG and the Flying Tigers. Let's talk for a minute about Dick Rossi. Tell us how you got flying, when and where.
well, I started with the Navy. I got into Navy flight training in 1939, September. I had been in the Merchant Marine for a few years, paying my way through Berkeley. And on one of my trips, I met a Navy captain commander, and I told him I was interested in Pensacola. And so when they got off the ship, well, they both gave me a letter of recommendation, and I thought, this is it. So it was the summer of '39, and I had just got back from a trip, and I decided I was going to go back to school that semester. And in the meantime, I had applied to Pan American for a job as a purser on their big clipper ships.
Mm-hmm. The China Clipper.
Yeah, the China Clipper. Mm-hmm. And I put in my application with the Navy, and then nothing was happening, so I went over to Berkeley and paid my registration for the fall semester, which in those days was $25.
Were you from the San Francisco area?
Yes, I was raised in San Francisco, born in California. Raised in San Francisco from 3rd grade on. But so all of a sudden, I get a call from Pan Am to come over for an interview and a physical, and I get a call from the Navy to go over for a physical. So I said, well, I'll go to the Navy first. If I make that, that's where I'll go.
That was your first choice?
That's my first choice. If I don't get that, I'll go to Pan Am, because I would like to get on those clipper ships. And if I don't make that, I'll go ahead and finish my semester.
As it turned out, the China Clipper flew for a very short time.
Yeah. We finally got land planes that would cover that distance. But anyway, I came through, so we had our elimination training over at Oakland Reserve Base, and we got through, and I went from there on down to Pensacola and got my training and got my wings down there. And then when you get in the Navy, you know, they always ask you what you want to do, and then they give you what
the opposite.
feel.
Yeah, they give you the opposite.
They say, well,
your wish list.
What kind of training do you want? Fighters, seaplanes, or flying boats? So when you put seaplanes on the tail end of your list, that's what you get.
You put what you really want? Yeah. They say you put what you really want last, and you'll get it.
But anyway, I got that, and so I
was the seaplanes. That wasn't PBY, was it?
No, single engine catapult.
Oh.
Seaplanes are scout planes from the battleships and cruisers. And so then when it came time, when I got my wings and ready to go to the fleet, said, well, where do you want to go? So I was wanting to get somewhere just, and I asked for the Philippines and Subic Bay. I asked for second choice of Honolulu and the third choice of Panama, Cocosolo. So my orders come back, you're going to be an instructor at Pensacola, right where I was.
One of those airplanes that you flew, I think that's the one that found Eddie Rickenbacker when he was in the Pacific. The big main pontoon in the center had a little door in it where you could get in. Was yours that big?
Well, it was. I don't imagine anybody getting in that thing.
Well, they made them bigger models where there was a little door, because I remember seeing the newsreels, and it showed Eddie Rickenbacker showing the plane that found them, and they got into the main pontoon.
Oh, yeah.
And then they had the two little pontoons on the wingtips.
Yeah, one on each wingtip.
But the big main pontoon, there was a little door there that they got into. But that was the type of airplane that you were flying.
That was correct, yeah. But almost all of my training was in biplanes, with the exception of the SNJ, which is, North American.
The Yellow Peril.
We had we had instrument instruction in the SNJ, which was a monoplane. And I did get to fly 4 hours in one seaplane, Curtiss SOC, because I was a little behind and I needed 4 more hours to catch up with my classmates. And so I got 4 hours in that because I'd had dental work done and missed 4 hours of flying.
So you were a Navy pilot when the call came out for the Flying Tigers?
Right. And I instructed there for about a year. And when I got this chance, or heard how they were recruiting, and contacted the right people, and it happened. I thought the Navy was doing it, and so I applied through the Navy. I got some pretty hot replies from the commandant's office that the Navy wouldn't do any such thing, and they advised me as a new ensign to tear up that request, which myself and my buddy Ricketts did. And when my squadron CO came back from Washington that deal, he said, you know, I was in Washington, they are getting some of these guys out of the service. He said, I recommended you, but I said, I think you're crazy to go. And I said, well, while you were gone, they had us tear up our applications. But in the meantime, we found out who was doing it. It was being done through Intercontinental Aviation in New York. And then they had a subsidiary called Central Aviation Manufacturing Corporation, CAMCO, which had an airplane factory in China. They'd built airplanes in Hankow, and then they'd moved it all over to Loy Wing. And they had a factory up there. And they were the ones with whom we signed up, who our contracts were, and who actually paid our bills. But of course, they got the money from the Lend-Lease.
So you resigned your commission, became a civilian,
Right.
and then as a civilian, you joined the Flying Tigers.
To China, yeah. Well, that was another thing. Our CO at the time was Captain Reed, and he was the first man to fly the Atlantic in the big old 4-engine flying.
Oh, there were 2 planes, weren't there, or a
There
crew?
started out as 4, I think. He was the NC-4. He was the only one that made it. But I think they taxied the last 400 or 500 miles. They went down. But anyway, he was very, very prominent in the Navy.
Incidentally, captain in the Navy is equal to full colonel in the Army.
Yeah, and in those days, there weren't that many captains. You know, the captain was a big rank.
The rank was frozen in those days.
And he went out, but while they came down to recruit us people, that weekend that we signed up, 36 of us signed up to go to China. And Reed was out on the North Atlantic with Roosevelt when they were having a meeting with Churchill up at Newfoundland. And when he got back from that and found out we left, he canceled all our resignations and threw us back in the Navy. And now the phone calls and telegrams between Pensacola and Washington and New York were going back and forth. And he had enough clout that they compromised with him and said, okay, half can go and half can't go. So
how did they pick the half?
they just took the last half that signed up. Luckily, Rick and my names were on the top because we had written to them ahead of time.
Oh, the last half that signed up didn't get to go.
Didn't get to go, so only...
First come, first served.
that was about it. So, but he was the only commandant. Every commandant tried to stop it. On every base that the guys were recruited.
Well, that's very predictable.
They tried it. They didn't want to lose people, but he was the only one I know of who was able to stop any of it.
So on July 4th, 1942, what happened to Dick Rossi?
Well, I left when my closest buddy there was Ricketts. We'd gone together, gone to school together, and trained together, and we were both instructing together. We went out to China together, and I figured I was down in Guilin when this 4th came, so I said, well, Rick's going to go home, so I'll go up and join him and go home with him. And he was up in Guilin and in Kunming, and his reasoning was, well, Rossi volunteers for everything, so I guess he's volunteered for that, so I'll get out and join him. So we crossed. He stayed the 2 weeks, and I didn't. So then I came on home. I came back to...
You didn't join the military?
No. I went back to...
What happened when you set foot on American soil?
Well, on my way home, I was getting a ride out on CNAC. I stopped at Dinjan, and they wanted me to start flying the hump. So I told them, and some of our boys already were doing it. So I said, no, I think I want to go home first, but I'll come back out. So they said, okay, and they gave me letters to the office, Pan American office in New York, because they were the ones that were taking care of all the pilots and maintenance for CNAC.
So who was your employer?
Pan American.
A corporation?
Well, Pan American, the airline, but we were a division of theirs called China National. It was part Pan Am and part Chinese government owned.
So you were a civilian?
So I was still a civilian, but...
So you didn't get drafted as a private?
Well, when I got home... Well, Bissell didn't have that much drag, you know. He was just all noise. But when I got home... when I got to Karachi, where we're trying to get transport home, this colonel who was in charge there said, gee, I'm sorry, I'd like to help you guys, but we get these orders from the Air Force not to help anybody get home. Bissell had put the word out. So I said, oh, darn it. And I mentioned being a Chinese pilot, and so I would rather having this deal with Pan Am. He said, oh, I'll put you on as a Pan Am ferry pilot. So I went home as a Pan Am ferry pilot, got all the way to Miami, and went up to New York, checked in with Pan Am, and took a couple months off at home and went back out.
So our story has a happy ending. We've enjoyed our visit with Dick Rossi, ace with the Flying Tigers. This is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes and the people who fly them. And as always, happy landing!
Thank you.